Hello, everyone. Welcome. How's everyone trickle in here?
I need a cigar that it's like half smoked.
I'm really glad that Chris just said yes to this request of mine.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris. I'm the events coordinator, and we are wildly excited to bring you the launch of Shudder by Melissa Larsen. She'll be in conversation with Mina Hamedi. I'll share a link to buy copies in the chat, and they'll be signed. We have signed book plates that will be added to any copy that you buy through the link. And if you have any questions, you can use the chat or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and they'll take your questions at the end of the event, and I'll introduce them now. Mina Hamedi grew up in Istanbul, Turkey, and is of Turkish Iranian descent. She has an MFA in nonfiction from Columbia University, and she works at the literary agency Janko and Nesbitt. She is writing a collection about her grandfather and the nature of legacies. Melissa Larsen has an MFA from Columbia University and a BA from NYU's Gallatin School of Individualized Study. She has interned and worked extensively in publishing, and she lives in San Francisco. Shudder is her first novel, and I'll hand it over now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everyone. I am beyond excited to be doing this with one of my best friends. You know, you build up a lot of stuff in your head, and you always think like, oh, the real thing can't possibly measure up. But in this instance, not only does Lissa measure up, but also Shudder. It's an incredible thriller, everyone, and just buy it. Take a day off from work, just do it. But I wanted to start this off with Lissa. Maybe you can read an excerpt or a passage for us, and then we can get into questions.
Definitely. So I thought I would give us a bit of the beginning, just so you know what you're getting into. Okay. Since landing in New York and crashing on the small, lumpy sofa in Ben and Sophia's apartment, I've heard Anthony Marino's name 1,000 times. Apparently, there isn't much this guy can't do, or at least that's how Ben sees it. If Anthony was here. That's a refrain I've heard so often, I've begun to wonder how a person can even exist without him. But that's all he's been to me, a name. Anthony Marino, the star of a million unlikely stories, a mythical hero. Sophia has promised me that Ben can secure me an audition with him, but after a month, I still haven't met him, and I'm starting to lose faith. I'm starting to think it's a mistake to count on this meeting, to believe that somehow the great Anthony Marino can help me. Ever since my father died, I've been drowning, or close to it. Like that moment when you're in the pool, underwater, holding your breath, and you cross that invisible threshold, and suddenly your heart is racing, and you realize your chest is about to explode. You don't stop to reflect. You don't have time. You simply break for the surface. Like sweaty. Except I haven't been able to reach it, no matter how hard I kick. Nothing has helped. Not breaking up with Tucker, not escaping to New York, nothing. And it's hard to feel like yourself when you can't breathe. It's hard to think when you're desperate. Then, without warning, at a dive bar in Greenpoint, where Ben has dragged Sophia and me to watch his musician friends perform for what feels like no one but us three, there he is, Anthony Marino. He appears over Ben's shoulder, looks at me, and asks, "What are you doing with these two clowns?" And like that, the name becomes a man. Whether he knew to expect him or not, Ben seems just as unprepared as I am. I get the feeling he never imagined Anthony would accept his invitation. Ben claps him on the back and says something I can't quite hear over the music, while fighting to catch my eye at the same time, unable to suppress a burst of pride. Sophia gives a tall man an awkward shove that somehow feels rehearsed. "Don't be such an asshole," she tells him, barking out a forced laugh. Turning to me, she explains, "We told him all about you, so now he's too shy to introduce himself. Anthony Marino," she says, "meet Elizabeth Rue." That's how it starts. And then we're outside, alone together, and I lose track of time. And then, so they audition, they go to a restaurant, kind of a dinner, a date, fun thing. And he's shown her a video he took of her that she didn't realize. All at once, the reality of this night hits me. I'm sitting in a restaurant in Brooklyn talking to Anthony Marino. No, auditioning for Anthony Marino. And he thinks I'm beautiful, like wandering into a labyrinth. I don't know how I got here, but this is real, isn't it? This is happening. Without lifting his gaze from the screen, Anthony tells my video self, this would be a commitment. This isn't your usual film. It's not a big budget sort of thing. It's going to be an intimate shoot. We'll live in my family's cabin up north for about a month, maybe more, maybe less. And that's where we'll be filming, in the cabin, on the water. It's just a small group of us, you, me, Ben, and Mads, the other actor, Mads Byrne. Well, you won't have heard of him since you haven't seen Reverence. Sophia's taking some days off work to join us for a bit too, but this film is low key, no extra crew, just me and Ben working the set. Are you comfortable with that? I sit back, considering him. This is so fast. We haven't done anything close to an audition, and I could believe, maybe, that he doesn't care whether I tell him yes or no, because he's been so casual about everything. He hasn't asked for anything from me yet, no references, no monologue, nothing. But he's looking at me too intently, his knuckles turning white around the camera, for this to be a spontaneous offer. Didn't Ben say that Anthony was too picky? He could have anyone, that's what he said. He's delayed filming to search for just the right actress. It seems he's found one. Me. I find myself saying yes before I can properly catch my breath. It doesn't even sound like a word, yes, just an emotion jettisoned into the air. It's a demanding project, he tells me. Most of it is pretty intuitive, but you'd have to be comfortable with some things. Nudity, for instance, some violence. Violence? I feel another smile climb my cheeks, this one an imperfect reflection of my unease. How can there be violence when the film consists of just Mads Byrne and me? What kind of violence? Like in a horror movie? He laughs. Nothing like that. Arguments, shouting, you know, that kind of stuff. Does it pay? Of course. How much? $20,000. I try to stifle my gasp. What happened to the small budget? That's upon signing. He crooks a finger in half-hearted air quotes, and then another $20,000 after we finish filming. Sound fair? Maybe there's more to this than I understand. $40,000? That's a lot of money. A person will do a lot for that. A person will be expected to do a lot. And I know this should make me nervous. Everything about tonight should make me nervous. Suddenly, I wish I were older. Maybe then I would know how to handle this situation. I would know the right thing to say, the right thing to ask about this project, and why he's so convinced I'm the one he wants after such a short time together. I would know how to look at this man and how to be looked at by him in turn. I wouldn't be so overwhelmed. But I'm not older. I'm just me. And no matter how much I know I should be, I'm not worried. This is like a dream come true, and I'm not going to question my impossibly good luck. I told people I wanted to be an actress in New York, and I meant it, even if it felt like a flimsy way of saying I wanted to figure out who I was after Dad, as far away as possible from anything that reminded me of him. Here is the opportunity to do exactly that with Anthony Marino. I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you,
I'm
Alyssa.
sweating like Nixon in a debate.
I always, whenever there's a Zoom session, I crank up the AC more so than usual. So I understand what you mean.
Should have done that.
So because I know you very well, I know that you're a stickler for first sentences. You know, that great first sentence that draws you in, you know, you hunger for more. Tell us about writing the first sentence for this novel. Like, did it change over time, or was it kind of, you knew you wanted that sentence to begin with?
It changed over time. There was the very first sentence that I wrote of Shudder that I thought, oh, this is going to be the sentence. I have it on the first try, was Betty standing outside while she's waiting, or not while she's waiting, while Anthony is talking to her, and she's looking at herself through what she thinks he sees. It was a very complicated sentence of her being kind of in his camera lens. And it was a little bit too complicated. And I thought about what a person, because I love first sentences and I judge books so harshly based on what I like about the first sentence. And I mean, my feelings about that change every time I look at a book. But in this case, I wanted the first sentence to introduce you to Betty as she is right before Anthony. So you feel her desperation, you feel how much she is lost and scared and desperate. And also, I wanted to say Anthony Marino's name about 100 times, like as many times as I could in the first chapter, because it's kind of like you want to know who he is. And it's the same way that you say Brad Pitt, kind of like an incantation. You're like, you would never call him Brad.
No, definitely not.
Never.
Anthony like asks Betty pretty early on, like what brought her to New York. And you write, grief, she says. She wasn't chasing anything. She was leaving something behind. What was it like to kind of write the darker moments, to write Betty's motivation and her backstory? Because you know it's so layered that, and it's all her. Like it's one thing to, you know, read a third person narrative, but this is all through her eyes.
That's a really good question. There were a lot of, it was very difficult in some ways. In some ways it was really easy and wonderful to explore who this person is and her level of varying intensities and her desperation. But in the darker moments, it was very tough. For example, there was a scene that I wrote. It happens pretty late in the book, so I'm not gonna tell you what it is. No spoilers, but I wrote it when I was on this writing retreat on a small island off the coast of Maine. And I had this incredible breakthrough. Oh, I need to put this in here. This is what happened. And it broke me. I spent the whole day writing it and I was sobbing, just horrible tears, just like holding myself. I went to the main house for a happy hour with all the other writers, and you know, it was just eyes puffy. Everyone was like, how are you doing? It was a lot of intense catharsis for this book, I think.
Is that what helps you like push through those moments of writing, the catharsis that you know you're going to feel after?
I think so, yeah. I think so much of the writing of, I mean, for me, when I'm writing, it's really very close to reading. It's very similar to, oh, I just want to see what happens next. And so when you reach a very difficult scene like that, then suddenly I'm pushing through it with her. So I'm both like watching it and I'm feeling it with her in that sense. It meant that for scenes like that, I was crying. For scenes that are a little bit more high paced and maybe violent, I was like pounding at the keyboard, really getting into it.
I know I'm trying so hard not to spoil anything with the questions I'm asking you, but maybe we can do this again once everyone's read it.
Like in a month, everyone should read it and we can talk about it.
So I feel like I'm gonna say Anthony a lot too. So Anthony gives Betty like her new identity, Lola, and like she's not even aware of this. Like he just springs it on her. Can you tell us what was going through your mind when you wrote that? Like I couldn't help but like just think like what kind of person is Anthony and what kind of person is Betty? Like you inhabit both of them so wholly and completely, and you know, one's a young woman, one's a young man, one is
control freak.
You said it. But yeah, and one is in like a very vulnerable spot, but also like she has her own secrets.
Yeah, I think with the Lola identity, it's both I'm really trying hard not to spoil things, but it's a tactic of displacing her even more. You know, she's already very vulnerable. So much of the shoot is dependent on this very vulnerable person and keeping her kind of keep pulling the rug out from under her every time. And at the same time, it's also a license for freedom. I think that was the biggest thing. That's why I held on to it for so long. It was just, she needs this, because when we meet Betty at the beginning, she is in fight or flight mode. She's just been running, shedding layers, and she's actually kind of enjoying it. Like, I think that's the really interesting thing. Like, as much as she's, desperate and can't breathe, this is also the first time she's ever really done anything for herself. And she's kind of discovering this new sense of, I could be this, I could do this. And giving her this new name and this new identity kind of lets her be the writer of her own story in a little way. Like, he's such a control freak, Anthony, but he's also good at reading people and knowing, like, okay, this is going to help her. She's going to feel in control.
Yeah, it's almost like he gives her that kind of permission.
Yeah.
I found myself trusting Betty so early on, perhaps to my detriment. Yeah, can you tell us, like, can you speak a bit more about that, like, backstory and building those layers and then having her shed them? Like, did you also, like, know the extent of which, how raw she would get? Still trying not to spoil anything.
I know. Yes and no. I think when I started writing it in the very first moment, like the very first thing that I saw when I'm very image based. I think for every chapter, it's kind of like there's one image that I'm thinking of. And when I first was thinking about Shudder, the image that came to me was Betty covered in blood asking for help. So I knew it was going to get raw. I knew it was going to get tough, but and I knew going into it, oh, this is the pain that she's feeling. But I think she's also I think the reason you trust her is because she's so vulnerable too, and she's fighting desperately for her life. She's fighting for her sanity. I think I was just trying to put it into words the other day, and it was like she's kind of like trying to find her footing in like an emotional hurricane.
That's definitely, yeah, that's definitely.
And we can all sympathize with that. I
think we all do, yeah. Go back to what you said about images though, because with Anthony wielding so much control, like the narrative kind of like has that same effect. I mean, I know my sister started reading today and she sent me a text just being like, I have anxiety, capital A. And I was like, yeah, I did too. And I read it in bed like nonstop. How do you kind of write that onto the page? And you said that each chapter has like an image for you. Yeah, were there those specific images that like you knew you had to hit those like no matter what?
It changed over the course of it. It was basically whenever I finished a chapter, I knew for the first chapter, what I saw was the camera and them at opposing sides of the table and that kind of like awkward first date image. And once you finish that, it kept coming. I was able to kind of anticipate the image beats, but it really changed based on who the characters were. Like Betty kept telling me, like, the thing that comes to mind is like, Jesus, take the wheel. Betty and Anthony were kind of fighting for the wheel at opposing times. I think when you're talking about anxiety in this book in particular, the tension comes from Anthony, like what Anthony is withholding, what he's leading her to, and if she'll follow him or if she'll fight him on it. And so that was actually particularly tough for me because I also want my characters to be happy.
To hell, no.
Yeah, they're all kind of tortured, but it was mostly just the kind of conversation between Anthony's agenda and what Betty wants from him. They both have opposing agendas.
Wonderful. On page 61, forgive me for reading your own stuff out loud to you, but Betty tells us about a memory. Not so long ago, I walked in a place where you could hear the stars. I stopped to listen and I stood until my toes ached. The northern lights glowed and fizzled and spread like pale green fireworks. Dad sidled up next to me. I caught his eye. He laughed wildly in the darkness, as if there was no other way to express everything he was feeling. and reaching for my gloved hand. I have never been colder. I have never been happier. I try not to return to this particular moment often. I don't want the memory to lose its sharp edges. Oh, the memories losing their sharp edges. I just wanted to, and I kind of know the answer to this, but do you think that writing is that sort of act of preservation for you?
Yes, for me in particular, I think it's so much, it's so distorted. You're distorting everything, like all of these different feelings. Like you and I were in Iceland together, and it's kind of distorting that experience into something different, but really feeling the emotion through that. Like it's kind of a prism for your feelings.
What about for like in terms of the film that she's about to be in for Betty, like the idea of her being on screen for forever in a certain way, it's not like she has like an extensive acting background.
Yeah, for her, it's a similar thing, except it's a reflection for her to see herself. It's so much of the book is about her evolving relationship with her image, because it's something that she should intrinsically be in control of, because that's her and that's how she is presenting herself. But it's really who is doing the recording, it's who is framing her is in control of her image. But she's thinking of it, I don't think I'm spoiling it by saying that at a certain point she's thinking of it as, people will see who I am now. I will see myself as who I am now through this film. It's a way of her, it's like she's talking to herself in it, which I guess is also a way of me saying I was also talking to myself as I wrote.
Yeah, I love that it is like essentially it's a story within a story, and Anthony trying to manipulate the outcomes, but it's like life doesn't work that way. Can you talk a bit more about using like a film as like a motif within, and then of course all the research that you had to do, or kind of you had to go about including all that?
Well, first of all, I want to talk about the research, because I when I was at NYU, I helped out on the set of my brother's thesis film, and it was a night shoot for about a week, and it was so wonderful. It was like entering into a different dimension, not just because I was sleep deprived, but because it was so interesting, all of the different like hardware that was involved with it, like stuff that you would never think about. They're constantly working on it's so, you realize how manipulative it all is, and how technical, and how bizarre it is to act. Like, I mean, I've never acted, but to watch someone go from like chatting to you about like what they just had for dinner and then be like crying in the next scene, it's very personal and strange to watch. And so for my research, basically was just kind of talking to Ray, my brother, and having him call me and say like, you can't do that.
That's a good brother.
In the earlier drafts of the novel, the movie was much more scripted. And I think I had, like in the very first draft, written that they were only going to get through, they only had a month to film, and they were going to go through like 2 pages of a script in a day. And Ray called me and just said like, that's preposterous. Like they could get through so much more than that. And then I did too much. So it was an interesting give and take. And then at a certain point, the film was getting in the way of the story that I wanted to tell. And so the film, that was the thing that morphed the most.
Interesting. Wait, can you talk a bit more about that morphing?
I'm gonna try to do it without spoiling.
Yeah, I know.
It was much more involved with Betty, with Lola and Mads's role, and they were play acting something else. And it just ended up feeling like it was the part that I hated to write. It was really, I mean, that was very telling that I was like going into it just like, ugh, okay, and now here's the movie. And once I peeled that back, the book kind of exploded in a good way.
That's awesome. I'll shift it from like that aspect to the setting, you know, island off the coast of Maine, which is of course perfectly spooky and isolated. So was that like originally kind of the setup, or did that come in after you had what you mentioned, you had like a writer's retreat? And I remember your stories from that. That itself is a whole other book. But
It really is. Like, I really wanted to include so much in the book that I couldn't. It was originally set, the estate that they go up to was going to be in upstate New York, just by the side of a lake. And I mean, it had felt good for me, but not great, just because I've said this, I'm from California. I find the East Coast like to be kind of spooky. Like when you get to upstate New York, it's kind of scary. And just the foliage, like, I should say. It's just
not the
the
people.
weather acts very differently, and like just the foliage looks so different. And that had felt good. I liked it being by a lake. I needed the water. But then it felt kind of like she could just run down the block. She could just go say, like, call a neighbor, walk to the end of the estate, get out. And I was just kind of like, well, she's just not going to. And then I signed up for this, I applied to this writer's retreat on a private island off the coast of Maine. And it was amazing. I hope some of those people are here tonight, because it was wild. And it was very much like living in my own book. I think I warned you and everyone in my life, like, okay, if I show up with different hair when I get back, if you don't hear from me in like 2 weeks, please call the police. Like,
No,
I was a little bit terrified.
For those who don't know, Alyssa already goes into writing bunkers where we just don't hear from her. But yeah, this was like, oh my God, like,
It was like, I'm not sure if I'm going to have cell phone service. And when I arrived, it was such a long, it's a very convoluted process of getting everyone onto the island, because there's only one person who knows how to steer the boat. And we got there very late at night. It had been like a full day of getting up to Maine, and they drove me on an ATV to my cabin in the middle of the woods. And I was like, where is it? Where? And they were like, that way. It was terrifying. And I didn't pack well for this. I didn't have anything warm. It was really like stepping into my book and then realizing, oh, this is how she feels. This is pretty terrifying. And then, of course, it became wonderful. It was a really like fantastic retreat, and all the people there were just fascinating. And everyone should go to the Norton Island residency, but it's a whole book in itself.
That's actually a perfect segue to my next question.
Ooh.
So I love this passage that's on page 148. Reading at you again, I'm so sorry.
I'll try not to freak out.
I hope I'm doing you justice. That's all I'm saying.
You are.
This landscape, so beautiful on first glance, gets bleaker the longer I stare at it. It reminds me of a forest in a fairy tale, maybe because of the way the branches are intertwined, like arms and fingers, and the way they sway, creaking, old doors at the slightest breeze. As Anthony had told me that first night at dinner, which now feels like another lifetime, being out in the wilderness here had made him believe in vampires. With a chill, I wonder if it's because of the darkness that seems to emanate from the mulchy soil. Despite the heat of the sun, I can still feel winter here. The trees are flinching in the sunlight as though they don't trust its warmth, or maybe they just don't want it. So there's such a sense of magic, even, and of wonder in between like the moments of terror and fear that Betty experiences. Can you speak to those moments?
I actually wrote that passage in Maine. I was trying to figure out, like, how do I explain this feeling? I think for the magic in particular, it's my proclivity, because I love stuff. I don't want to think that the world is just as we see it. But for Betty in particular, I think it's a way of explaining just how she feels in this moment, just this kind of mixture of, as you say, terror and fear and kind of delight. Because again, she's free, like in between these anxieties and in between this kind of power struggle, she's being selfish for the first time in her life. She's kind of enjoying this new sense of, I've never been here before. Like, I never would have done this before. It's just kind of this new layer that she's shedding and feeling like extra sensitive. Her skin hasn't, calloused up yet.
Was Betty the hardest character to write?
No, she was the most interesting character to write. She was very fun. It was like a best friend that you're kind of like slowly, getting into different, deeper layers. The hardest character to write was Anthony, because I knew people were going to hate his guts, and I liked him, and so it was I find him really interesting and sympathetic and horrible at the same time. I think he's very fascinating, but he's also a really hard person to write because he can be very cold, he's very calculating, and he's also very strange. I think he's much more disengaged, but also like constantly looking.
Yeah, that weirdness is, I definitely agree with that, especially when you kind of like pit him against Sam. More of a, like, again, to not spoil anything, there's more of a stability to Sam. Like, I'm more inclined to be like, I kind of trust him more than I would trust Anthony.
Yeah.
What was your vision for that pair, for that kind of like, did you ultimately know what you wanted to happen, or did it kind of come through the writing?
I love Sam. I love Sammy. He's very charming. He's got like a natural kind of weird charisma that you see in like a really good car salesman, where you're just like, oh yeah, you're my friend. You are my friend for today. And he's very he's much more, he's less guarded in a way. But it's interesting, the two of them, I always wanted this to be kind of like they're two sides of the same coin. Like for one, the strength that one has is a weakness in the others. And I think that charm is like the biggest one in the beginning, where it's just like, okay, so Anthony does have this magnetism, but Sammy, you're like, okay, let's go have a beer. And I always wanted it. I'm sorry?
I'm interrupting you, but it's like one is inherent and the other is studied. It's like Anthony studied.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. Like you're a little bit like drop the mask. And I think what I had seen, I'd also wanted it to be that rich boy, poor boy kind of dynamic that they're both very dominating people. They both kind of want to be the alpha in the room, but the way that they go about that is very different. And I think the way they weaponize the things about themselves. So they're very similar, but they're also, they're balanced and imbalanced.
So Anthony's film is inspired by Cape Fear, which if none of you have watched it, please do. And that was the music that was playing earlier.
The best music.
Because Chris is a wonderful host and goes with our whims. Can you tell us about like the movies, the stories, art, like whatever it is that kind of inspired you, that you kept coming back to as you were writing?
Well, Cape Fear obviously is a just such a rich well. But for me, the art that I was engaging with most, and I make that sound really highfalutin, it was very obsessive. Like you talk about my writing bunker. In my writing bunker, I was kind of in this really creepy loop where I was watching Scream, which is such a great movie, The Ruins, which is a very weird one, and yes, Josie and the Pussycats, that's in there. That's for the lightness. And like Vertigo and Ghost, Death Trap. Like I wanted I was really invested in these weird kind of like plays off of horror movies, or just a straight horror movie. But then I was also at the same time obsessively rereading like 3 books where it was Night Film by Marisha Pessl, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which I read for the first time in Maine. That was amazing. Highly recommend everyone do that. And Tana French's The Likeness, which is, I think, very heavily inspired by Rebecca, where it's, you know, very much about like this love of a house, of a single estate, and what it feels like to be in this group, and how feral you can get when you see an outsider, where you're just like, this is us. And I think in all of those, I was trying to like, it sounds really horrible. They were like people that I was talking to at the time. Like, I think
Not horrible at all. That makes a lot of sense.
it was like this constant internal like dialogue with these different characters. Like when I think about Night Film, which is it's told from the perspective of this like middle-aged journalist who is, you know, on his like revenge mission to investigate the supposed suicide of this young woman. And he teams up with these 2 younger people, this young man and this young woman. I've read that so many times now that I am like, oh yeah, this is the moment when he's not really in the way and I can hang out with these 2 young people because they're so interesting. It was very much like all of these things are very atmospheric and very intense, but it feels like there's also a special magic in each of them where you feel like you're their friend.
That's awesome. Well, I mean,
I hope it is.
I mean, I obsessively watch a lot of the things that you've mentioned.
Oh my God.
So
Yeah.
no judgment here. You mentioned in an interview that like the worst advice that you received personally as a writer was to like write X amount of words per day. I'm gonna have to ask you the generic question of like, what is your process and how did you figure out kind of what works for you creatively?
I think I'm still
along with the bunker.
Yeah, the bunker is, people should really try bunkers. I think I'm still learning my process. I think it changes based on the project, but for Shudder, it was bunker central. Like, I think I was so obsessed with this story and I was so excited by it that it was like, I don't need to worry about how many words a day I write. It's going to happen. I just want to see what happens next. And I think it kept kind of coming out in huge rushes. And I think Alexandra Kleeman described it as different writing types as predators versus, or not predators, carnivores versus herbivores. It's the same thing.
Predatory writing, okay.
Yeah. And I think I used to think, oh yeah, no, I'm an herbivore. I'm like chipping away at this, but no, I'm a carnivore in this sense where it's very much like you're hunting, you eat, you gorge, and then there's a fallow period where you're digesting and you're kind of trying to figure out the next hunt. And I think that kept happening with Shudder, where I gorge on the book and then I send it out, wait for my editor, and then kind of hit this weird rock bottom feeling of, oh my God, I'm not writing. Oh my God, I'm awful. My emotions were up and down because I wasn't writing. And then suddenly it'd be like, oh, we're back on. It was just, I'm trying to make it more predictable, but it's good to know that that's like at least the process.
Before, your editor was in the picture, would you edit a lot while you wrote, or would it be like big bursts of writing, like you said, like the gorging and then the kind of sitting with it?
I think before the editor got involved, I had to plow ahead. I really wanted to edit, desperately wanted to edit, but my father actually was the one who was like, just keep going, just don't stop, because what had happened was I had started a book back in undergrad at NYU, and I became really stuck thinking about the first chapter where I was like, but I have to make it perfect. I really need it to be great before I can move on. And then it got to the point where I was like, but these are the only good words I'll ever be able to write. And I didn't write for years because of that. And Lara Vapner was the one who sat me down and said, you're using your perfectionism to procrastinate. Please stop. And that is, I think about that all the time. And it helps when you realize, yeah, I'm just trying to procrastinate by being like, oh, I'll tinker with this. So I wrote the full first draft, just trying to not look back, and then making notes to myself, okay, I have to fix that. But
That's incredible. What advice would you give to writers, like if they are in that kind of stuck like moment? Because I definitely feel it sometimes too. I'm like, I am not inspired and I will never write a single word again.
Oh, I feel that all the time. Like all the time. But I think there are many things come to mind, is to first of all read, because I have had enormous breakthroughs with Shudder where when I was reading something else, like on a plane, I would suddenly, it wasn't even anything that was happening with the book that I was reading. It was just kind of like the back of your mind is kind of always working, and then you think of it. Plus, it's just important to read. But I would also say something that's kind of fun is thinking about like, what wouldn't the character do? Like, you're just kind of, you're always like, for me, it's always very character propelled, but it's easier. I do this, I teach creative writing to high school students, and I often ask that, like, okay, so what would this person not do? And then that gets them thinking, okay, what is this person like? And what are they actually trying to achieve in this plot? It's a good writing exercise.
I'm gonna use it. Yeah. Is there anything kind of that you learned while writing your first book and publishing, finding your agent, that you're definitely gonna carry with you to like the next project?
I think we talk about like writing is rewriting, but no one ever talks about how intense revision can be. And I think especially when you're young, and especially when it's your first book, you're like, as much as there's the self-doubt, you're kind of like, this is perfection. This is my vision. To realize that it's a constant conversation, and that every revision, every time you tear apart something, it gets so much stronger and so much more interesting. And I think for me, I got to, because my editor and I went through a lot of revision, I got to really sit with myself and think about like, what are the hills that I will die on? And there were very few. And I just wanted to make the book very good and fun to read. And so I think what I'm carrying with me is this idea that revision is just different layers of paint on the painting, as opposed to, I'm a terrible writer and I can't do this, or no, but this paragraph needs to be here.
I love that, like you tearing something kind of open and it becoming stronger. Oh,
this bled a lot.
But I mean, in the end, like if you're able to have your perspective on it, that's incredible. And I think, yeah, not being kind of stuck in what a story can be.
Yeah, because it's so wonderful once you get a little bit of that perspective. Like even now, I mean, I love Shudder. Even now, I was like, why didn't I do this? But I think that happens for everyone, and I think you can constantly revise something, but it's nice to not be precious about it too.
Well, on that note, I'm gonna open it up to questions. So please, if you want to type it in the Q&A portion, or I mean, if you're scared to do that, you can type it in the chat and I can look at it. But we already have a question from Tima Kessler.
Who's that?
I wonder, was Betty inspired by a real person?
Oh, Not really. I think Betty was inspired by a character from the book that I had started at NYU that I never could finish for years. I had started writing a book from Anthony's perspective, actually, and it was all about his story. It wasn't about filmmaking. It wasn't very good. It's a
What I
book that no one will
remember-
ever see. You remember parts of it?
I remember parts of it.
There are like 60 people probably wandering this earth who've read part of it who need to get like the Men in Black thing. But I had written that book, and Betty was a character that he was kind of obsessed with. And I had always been kind of intrigued by her because he was, and I was thinking like, oh, she seems much more interesting. And so from then, when I finished that book in the first few months of my MFA, I realized she's the one I want to write about. And so she's her own person.
Yeah, I think one of my questions that I kind of just glossed over was, had you originally thought of narrating it from a different point of view? But I can't imagine this not being in Betty's voice. Yeah.
It's so interesting. Like I also talk about this with my high school students a lot, because perspective in a story, like the point of view, is so interesting, and it feels very like instinctive that you choose this person to do it. But when you think about it, like this book very perfectly could be Anthony's perspective also. It could be his story, and but you would lose so much of it. And it's very interesting how if you start to think about like, what if it's from Sammy's point of view? What if it's from Ben's? It's a lot like kind of thinking about The Great Gatsby, though, is do you want to really get into Gatsby's head where he's like, oh, Daisy?
No, thank you. Next question. What are you working on next?
And another book. My cheeks instantly got redder because I can't talk about it without losing the thread of it entirely. When I start drafting in this phase, it's a huge secret, and you can attest to that, actually, because you didn't read Shudder for a while.
I do want to tell our audience that yes, I waited until, was it like after it was copy edited?
Before copy edits.
Before copy edits.
Which was
That's how long I waited. Yeah.
I think you waited 3 years. Maybe.
You
A
made
little
me
less.
wait another 3 years, Melissa.
No, don't worry. I wanted it to be perfect, and it kept changing.
Okay. Next question from Mo. Besides Cape Fear and Rebecca, what other films helped guide Shudder? Did writing the novel inspire a film playlist?
Ooh, I want to counter that with, can you send me a film playlist of this? I think I revisited a lot of horror movies that scared me. I think that's why The Ruins became such a big obsession with me, because I had seen that in the movie theater when I was 15. And it's just such an awful body horror kind of thing. And I kept watching it, kind of hoping for a different ending. But the movies that ended up the 2 movies that I think were the most comforting to me during the writing process, more than Scream and more than The Ruins, was Adaptation, because it's just so good, and it's about writing. And it's got Nicolas Cage, our favorite, and then also the film Brooklyn, which is even referenced in this, and Ghost, which is also referenced in this. I managed to sneak in everything that I wanted to.
I love that, though. I mean, that's why it feels like it's like carrying a piece of you. So
yeah, it's like a yearbook in a way.
Do you find that you're like sick of those things now that you're kind of like done with the book and it's published, or are you just still like, no, these will always just hold us?
Not at all sick of them. I wonder if that's like good for me or not, because I am still really drawn to all of these things. Like I am still desperate to watch like Death Trap and adaptation, and I really love Night Film. I've listened to it so many times on audiobook. I really think I have it memorized. Like there is one chapter in there where I'm like, okay, here we go. I think I recently converted a friend to the Ton of French book that was so beautiful, and she was like, "Is anything else this magic?" It's like, no.
Oh no.
Like that's why it's so good. I think I'm always kind of branching out, luckily. But those I'm not sick of them.
Lauren Jaggers asks, has there been any part of the publishing process that was surprising, interesting, or shocking?
It's fantastic that he asks this, because I thought that the marketing and publicity was the most shocking, because I had expected
Sorry, Jamie.
I had expected a lot of the editorial process. I had watched this happen. I kind of understood, okay, this is what we're going to do. This I'm in control of. It was very much like, again, the Jesus take the wheel, where I was driving the car for so long. And then suddenly, like 4 other people were like, we've got it. Sit back. Like, you can tell us some stuff, like what music do you want to listen to, but we're going. And I think that has been the most like fruitful, where you're just I think I keep saying like, now it feels real. Now it feels real that this is an actual book, but they've been really a part of making it feel real, where they're just like, oh yeah, we've been pitching it. And you're like, but it's my imaginary
But
friends.
it was in here. Yeah, it was in
Yeah.
here. That's incredible. I love that. Another question from Taima. What character do you see yourself most in?
All of them. That's a really good question. I think, God, if only I could say Mads. There's a character in there who he is just, I don't know if everyone knows the term himbo, but it's like a Brendan Fraser character, where if only I could be that pure and like sweet, but
pretty, but also dumb.
Yeah, kind of dumb, kind of smart dumb. But I think if I were, I think my answer would change given on my mood. But I think Betty would probably be she's my girl.
Oh, I really like this question. Chloe Cole asks, why do you think people are drawn to the horror genre in fiction and film? And how did you incorporate what you think / feel about the horror genre into Shudder?
Oh, that's such a good question.
Really good question.
It's interesting. I can only speak for myself, I find the horror genre to be just so electric, just so interesting. And it's I talk about catharsis a lot, and I think that there's this very intense catharsis where you're going through the emotions that these characters, if you care about them even a tiny bit, you are experiencing fear, you're experiencing their anxiety, but in a controlled kind of environment, and you're able to articulate certain things. I think the horror genre in particular articulates fear and anxiety, not just in like the domestic sense or the psychological sense, just this kind of these emotions that you otherwise couldn't really name or say, like, this is why I'm this scared, or this is why it's hard. Like in the case of even, the Babadook, this is why it's hard to be a mother to a difficult child. Like, I think it's all of it's it's translating feelings into metaphors, into really interesting metaphors. And it's also just really exciting. I think you can particularly feel the filmmaker or the writer having a lot of fun with it too. I think that adds to it a lot. And did I miss the second part of that question? I'm just kind of like, I love horror.
Hold on. Let me pull back. Kind of how do you incorporate what you think and feel about the genre itself into Shudder?
I think that one was a little bit tougher because Betty in particular isn't very much of a horror film watcher. You know, she kind of encounters Anthony's film, which is an art house film, not very much of a horror film, but she's much more like rom-com-esque of a watcher. I think the way that I incorporated it was the setting was we're all kind of like wink, wink aware. Oh, it's a cabin in the woods. Oh, this is a group. Oh, this is a woman. It's Danielle, my editor, who is there, will say I had to pull back the meta, but it was very there. It was very much there. I think we're all kind of like winking at each other when we start reading this. Like the Betty, don't go in there.
Speaking of kind of the setting and the landscape, we have a question from Anthony Cousins. Nothing to do with Anthony Marino. Is your next novel also kind of influenced by the landscape that you write in?
Yes, absolutely. That's a really great question. I think it's interesting. Like I'm very image based, as I've said, and at the same time, I'm also very place based. I think when I was working my way into this new story, the very first thing I was thinking about was setting, or it was just like, this is such a beautiful, great, like delicious kind of place. What can I set here? It was kind of, it was a huge give and take on that. Like, I think I think what we can all tell is that I love houses or buildings, and I love the way that they're portrayed in media. Like, I mean, Rebecca, obviously, Manderley, and Tana French, the likeness has that. And I think I just
Houseboat and Cape Fear.
Yeah, exactly. And in Shudder, like the main house and the cabins, I was very attached to that immediately. I was like, this is what the house is going to look like. I get to create a house.
I do love that you went for it, and obviously not to be that person, but it's very Stephen King of you.
I'll just get redder and redder.
It's okay, I'll distract you.
Thank you.
Mo is asking, which character would you least like to share a room with on a Maid island? Slash leave the most room for the Holy Spirit.
Well, I mean, obviously, the one I would most want to share the Holy Spirit space with is, I think, Mads. That dumb idiot. But I think, the least one would probably be Anthony.
Yeah.
I was like kind of sifting through like who would I not want, and I think Anthony I wouldn't be able to fall asleep next to.
Or maybe Ben, just because I feel like he'd be annoying. I don't know.
Yeah, I think he's kind of like a fussy sleeper.
Danielle asks, have any horror films or novels scared you way more than you would expected?
Ooh, yes. The first one that comes to mind is The Haunting of Hill House. I read that for the first time a few years ago, for some reason, in the middle of the night. And I wanted to read it all at once, and it was very intense, and I was starting to get more and more terrified of, in particular, this scene where something is trying to get through a door, and there's knocking and the doorknob is moving, is shaking, and I just started to mutter to myself like, oh fuck, oh fuck, oh fuck, oh fuck. And I think that when I was kind of out of my mind. And another one, the horror film that comes to mind is, I think I saw this with you, was It Follows.
Oh god, yeah.
With there's one scene,
I want to say.
Yes.
Yes.
There's this one scene where the creature that's following the woman comes through a doorway and he's suddenly like super tall and has
Yes.
a gaunt face. And I just, again, I'm learning something about myself here is that I started to sink into my seat like, oh fuck, oh fuck, oh fuck, oh fuck, oh fuck. I think that's my reaction when the emotions are too big for me.
I completely remember the scene that you're talking about. I also remember you and Taima being like, as I was telling you I was going through my door, to be like, look behind you.
We would all like left to walk home alone, like
Yeah.
texting each other, like, I think someone's following me.
Okay, I love this question. It's from Zainab. I know you're also a very talented illustrator. Does practicing a second medium help you look at writing in a different way?
Oh, I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because they're very different practices for me. So if I'm painting or drawing something, I generally have like they call it like the flow state, I guess, where you're just suddenly, for me, I'm not thinking of anything while it's happening. Like I'm kind of listening to something and I'm thinking about, usually I'm drawing a gift for a friend, as you know. And so I'm kind of thinking about how much I love them, but it's usually not very conscious, whereas with writing it's hyper conscious and it's very different. Like it's a different kind of flow where you want to be lost in a different story and you're in another world. Like there were so many times where I was writing Shudder and your phone rings and you're like, but I'm in Maine. And but at the same time it's still like the wheels are constantly turning. I'm always thinking about like 5 different things.
But does one kind of give you reprieve from the other? Like,
Yeah, I think I'm always really refreshed after painting something, whereas with writing, it's usually like I emerge as a husk. So it's kind of like refilling the creative well and then emptying it. I should be painting more though. Now that I articulate this, it sounds really nice.
well, maybe you will now that you've told people and this is recorded. So
Exactly. Now people can hold me to this.
exactly. Well, I don't think we have any more questions. We're a little over our 1 hour mark. If there are any more questions, please shoot them at me really quickly. If not, then this was a pleasure, Lissa.
Thank you so much, Mina.
And thank you so much, Chris, and to
Yeah, thank
Powerhouse
you.
for
Yeah,
hosting
thank you,
this.
both of you. Thank you, Mina. Thank you, Melissa. Everyone who asked questions is excellent. You can buy copies of Melissa's book from Powerhouse if you haven't yet. And we have the link in the chat and also on the event page. And if you missed any of the event for any reason, we'll have it on YouTube. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lissa. Congrats.
Thank you. Oh my God.
Bye.